911 emergency.
This is Merlin Jerzak calling from 29458 Kiwi Court in St. Joe. I'm right now next door to my neighbors, the Jerry Wetterling family. Some of their boys went down to Tom Thumb to pick up a movie, and on their way back, someone stopped them. We believe that they have one of the boys because one of the boys did not come back with them.
On the evening of October 22, 1989, in St. Joseph, Minnesota, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother Trevor, who was 10, and his best friend Aaron Larson, also 11, were riding their bikes back from a convenience store when a masked man with a gun emerged from the bushes and ordered the boys to lay face down on the ground. After asking each of the boys their ages, he took Jacob and told the other boys to run away and not look back. This was the last time anyone saw Jacob alive. What could have happened to Jacob Wetterling? How long would it take authorities to solve this case? Hello, and welcome back to Mysterious 7. Today we're looking at a cold case from 1989 that was finally solved after 27 years with the help of a mom turned amateur sleuth. But first, if you're enjoying our content, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it helps us and motivates us to keep creating intriguing content for you. Now that that's done, let's dive into the case. Our case today takes us to St. Joseph, a small town in Stearns County in the state of Minnesota, about 75 miles northwest of the city of Minneapolis. With a population of just over 7,000 people, living in St. Joseph offers residents a sparse suburban feel, and most residents own their homes. Many young professionals live in St. Joseph, and it's also home to the College of St. Benedict. The Quarry Park and Nature Reserve offers a beautiful space for those who love the outdoors to explore. But it was here in this little, seemingly idyllic town that a horrific crime took place in October 1989. Before we get there, we must go back to the very beginning, when Jacob Wetterling was born on February 17, 1978, in Long Prairie, Minnesota, to Jerry and Patty Wetterling, who were overjoyed at the birth of their firstborn. Jacob was the oldest of 4 children, with a younger brother named Trevor and 2 younger sisters named Amy and Carmen. The family lived in St. Joseph, a small town in central Minnesota. A large family of 6, they shared everything, and Jacob grew up in a house full of love and laughter. Jacob was an athletic and outgoing boy who loved sports, music, and animals. He played on several sports teams, including the basketball and baseball teams for his school, and was known for his sense of humor and kind-hearted nature. Jacob was a dedicated student and had a passion for science, particularly astronomy. Him and his younger brother Trevor used to love riding their bikes, and they were given a free rein by their parents to do so, like most children of that generation were. They loved exploring the great outdoors and the independence they felt while riding their bikes around the town. Tragically, it was when they least expected it during one of those rides that a heinous event took place. October 22, 1989 was a peaceful Sunday in St. Joseph, Minnesota. With it being everyone's day off, the Wetterling family spent a relaxed day at home. In the evening, the parents, Jerry and Patty, got ready as they had a dinner party in Clearwater, about 20 miles away, that they'd been invited to. As the oldest, Jacob was expected to look after his younger siblings, Trevor, Carmen, and Amy, while their parents were at the party. Patty wanted the children to stay at home, as she and her husband hadn't had a night out to themselves in a while. After they left, around 9 p.m., Patty got a call at the party from Jacob, who asked if he and Trevor could ride their bikes to the local Tom Thumb convenience store to rent a movie. She said no. It was already dark, and if they did go, it would mean that they'd have to leave their younger sisters at home alone with no supervision. The boys were disappointed, but didn't give up immediately. Next, they called their father, Jerry, and asked him if they could make the short trip to the store. They promised him that they'd be careful and that they'd wear reflective vests and use their flashlights on the ride to the video store, which was about a mile away. They also told him that they'd spoken to their neighbors who had agreed to have their 14-year-old child babysit the girls while the two brothers biked to the store. Seeing how badly the boys wanted to go, Jerry agreed, and Jacob quickly called his friend Aaron Larson, who met him and Trevor at their house, and the three of them set off for the video store on their bikes. They made it to the video store with no problems, and once they were there, they spent a few minutes browsing the shelves for the movie they wanted. They finally chose the film The Naked Gun on VHS, and having rented it, got back on their bikes and began pedaling back home. The boys were going slow. It was dark, and they were using their flashlights to see. After they'd been cycling for a few minutes, they were alarmed when a masked man emerged from a driveway and blocked their path. Their alarm turned to fear when he pointed a gun at them and told them to get off their bikes. He told them to throw their bikes into a ditch next to the road and made all three lie face down on the road. He then asked all three of them how old they were. When he learned Trevor was the youngest, he told him to get up slowly and then run towards a nearby wooded area. He warned him that if he made any noise or looked back, he'd be shot. Terrified, Trevor did what the man said. The masked man then turned his attention toward the other two boys. He asked both of them to lift their faces off the asphalt and to look at him so he could see their faces. After a moment's deliberation, he seemed to focus on Jacob. He then told Aaron to get up and run away slowly, threatening him in the same way that he had Trevor just a few moments ago. Aaron too complied with his instructions, got up slowly and took a last look at his best friend Jacob. He then turned and ran towards the wooded area where Trevor had gone. This was the last time anyone other than the masked captor would see Jacob alive. Despite being understandably terrified and traumatized by their experience, both Trevor and Aaron knew that Jacob was in much more trouble than they were. They rushed back to Jacob and Trevor's home, and as no adults were present, they told their neighbor's daughter, who had been babysitting the girls, what had happened. The boys were visibly shaken, and the girl knew that they were not joking and that something awful had taken place. She called her father, Merlin Jerzak, who came over to the Wetterling's house. He quickly called Patty and Jerry, who were still at the dinner party, as well as the authorities, who responded immediately.
911 emergency. This is Merlin Jerzak calling from 29458 Kiwi Court in St. Joe. I'm right now next door to my neighbors, the Jerry Wetterling family.
That's where you're calling?
And some of their boys went down to Tom Thumb to pick up a movie, and on their way back, someone stopped them. We believe that they have one of the boys because one of the boys did not come back with them.
Okay, were they picked up in a vehicle?
Just a second, I'll ask the boys. Was there a vehicle there, or was he walking? They didn't see a vehicle. This person appeared on the road when they were bicycling back home.
And they don't know where the other friend is at?
They don't know where their brother and friend is at.
So we're missing two people?
They're just missing one.
Did they see the individual at all?
Yes, they did. Did you see the individual at all? He had a mask on.
Patty and Jerry quickly returned home from their dinner party. They were devastated by what had happened to Jacob, but were also relieved that their other son Trevor was safe and at home. Soon, a full-on search for Jacob began. Numerous officers from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office descended on the dead-end road from where Jacob was abducted. But in the early stages of the investigation, that very night, the officers made a crucial mistake. They failed to interview everyone in the homes around the abduction site that very night itself. In missing persons cases, like Jacob's abduction, it's often crucial for authorities to interview the people in and around the area where the abduction took place within the first 24 hours of the search beginning. This is because people's memories will still be freshest, and it's more likely that they would have seen or heard something out of the ordinary, as compared to people further away from the point of abduction. However, police at the time were perhaps too confident that they would find Jacob quickly, which is why they failed to take the necessary steps. The officers from the sheriff's department focused on searching for Jacob on foot and by air from a helicopter, rather than speaking to everyone who lived close to the site of the abduction. They did, however, speak to one man, named Dan Rassier, who lived very close to the spot where Jacob was abducted. Dan told them that the very same night Jacob was abducted, he'd seen a small car speed up his driveway and then pull a sharp turn and return the way it had come when it realized the road was a dead end. The police at the time believed that this could very likely have been the car of the culprit, and they found tire tracks near the abduction site that were taken as evidence. But at the time, they also suspected Rassier himself due to his proximity to the crime scene. Stearns County Sheriff Charlie Graft remembers thinking at the time that the case would likely be solved in a matter of hours due to the fact that the police responded so quickly to the scene, meaning the suspect had very little time to get away. But he could not have been more wrong. That first night, the search was called off at around 3 a.m. on October 23, 1989, due to a lack of light. Officers resumed searching for Jacob in the morning of the same day at 8 a.m. When the search resumed, the officers from the Stearns County Sheriff's Department were joined by federal agents from the FBI who joined the case to help in both the search and the investigation. On the 24th, an FBI profiler joined the case, and from what was known about the abduction and the person who took Jacob, he suggested that the man was likely a white loner with a physical deformity who committed a similar crime in his past. On the 25th, a prayer vigil was held at St. Joseph Church, which drew over 500 people who came and prayed for Joseph's safe return. On Thursday the 26th, the case was broadcast nationally, and business leaders from Minneapolis and St. Paul offered a $100,000 reward for the safe return of Jacob. On the 27th, the governor of the state of Minnesota said the National Guard was going to join in the search along with the state patrol, and they'd search an area of 700 square miles around St. Joseph in the hopes of finding Jacob. The search for Jacob was one of the largest ever undertaken in the United States. The case itself received huge media coverage, and all over the country, people showed their support for the Wetterling family in a number of ways. People wore white ribbons pinned to their shirt as a symbol. Thousands of flyers were printed and stuck in store windows, delivered in pizza boxes, and sent by mail. Radio stations across the state of Minnesota played Jacob's favorite song along with a recorded message from his mother, Patty. In an era before the internet, these were the methods used by people to get the word out about the missing child. Hundreds of searchers volunteered to help search for the child, with many putting in 18-hour shifts. Sniffer dogs were used to try and track his scent, but with no luck. By the end of the first week, on October 29th, there were over 100 agents and officers from a number of both state-level and national agencies, all working on the case. But sadly, there was no trace of Jacob. Looking back, many have criticized the law enforcement of that time from making the search too big, too fast. Instead of creating a wide-scale manhunt that received national media attention, they should have focused on a small circle surrounding the point of abduction and made sure to exhaustively interview all who were present there first, before moving on to a larger search. In the month of November 1989, investigators released sketches on 3 different dates to the public. One on the 6th, of a man seen in the Tom Thumb convenience store on the night of the abduction. They described him as glaring at customers. He was white, in his 50s, weighing 200 pounds with white hair. 6 days later, on November 12th, they released 2 more sketches. One was of a man heard talking about the abduction in the Tom Thumb store 2 weeks after it took place. The other was of a man thought to have tried to abduct a boy in the Minneapolis suburb of New Brighton. They say both of these match the earlier sketch of the man seen lurking in the Tom Thumb convenience store on the night of Jacob's abduction. They received a flurry of tips from these sketches, but none panned out. On November 30th, they released a composite sketch that they considered to be the most accurate of the abductor, and it combined aspects of the 3 previous sketches. Even though investigators received a number of tips from this composite sketch, none of them led anywhere concrete. On December 13th, FBI investigators spoke to Jared Sherrill, a 12-year-old victim of an assault and abduction that had taken place in January of 1989 in Cold Spring, a nearby town. Investigators believe that the culprit from both these cases might be the same individual, and they met with Jared to ask him to help them create a sketch of the man who abducted him. The sketch that Jared helped them make was widely circulated and generated hundreds of new tips and added more investigators to the case. On December 16th, FBI agents interviewed a possible suspect, a man named Daniel James Heinrich, a resident of Paynesville, about 30 miles from St. Joseph. There had been a number of abductions and assaults against young boys in that area over the past few years, not including Jacob and Jared. But when FBI agents interviewed Heinrich, he denied any knowledge of the cases of Jacob and Jared. Investigators were left scratching their heads, wondering where next to search. About a month later, on January 12, 1990, they again zeroed in on Heinrich and interviewed him again. This time, he provided them with his tennis shoes and samples of his body hair to test against any evidence they had. 3 days later, on January 15th, Heinrich authorized investigators to take the rear tires from his blue 1982 Ford EXP hatchback to test against tire tracks that they'd found at the abduction site of Jacob. The next day, on January 16th, investigators learned that Heinrich owned another car, a 1989 Mercury Topaz, till March 1989. This meant that if he had indeed abducted Jared, it would have been in this car. They gained access to this car, and when they had Jared sit in it, he told them that on a scale of 1 to 10, the vehicle was an 8 or 9 in terms of how similar it was to the car in which he was abducted a year earlier. On January 24th, Heinrich's home was searched by agents, and they confiscated a number of items, including 2 police scanners, a carrying case, lists of scanner frequencies, a pair of boots, and clothing. On January 26th, Heinrich was made to appear in a police lineup with 5 other white males for Jared to observe. He was unable to identify if any were the person to abduct him, and only rated Heinrich a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10. On February the 9th, 1990, the FBI received evidence that a fiber found on Jared's clothing matched fibers taken from the Mercury Topaz that Heinrich owned in January 1989. That same day, Heinrich was arrested in connection to Jared's abduction and assault case, but he denied any involvement in it and was released without being charged. After this, the number of agents working on Jacob's disappearance slowly began to decrease over time, as the number of leads to follow up on dried up. Eventually, even though the case could not be closed, as missing persons investigations must remain open, the trail was lost, and the case went cold. For the Wetterling family, the entire search and investigation was a horrible ordeal. Despite the overwhelming support they received from their community and people from all over the country, they were heartbroken from the loss of their child and sibling. As more and more time passed, they slowly began to wonder if Jacob would ever return alive to them. But even in her grief, Patty Wetterling resolved that other families like hers should not have to endure the pain that she and her family had to go through. To help with this, the Wetterlings announced plans to establish the Jacob Wetterling Foundation on January 16, 1990. Their mission was to educate the public about the criminals who take children, how they do it, and what each member of the community can do to stop it. Though the family were in unbelievable pain themselves, they used this pain to help others in whatever way they could. Jacob's case changed the entire landscape of U.S. law surrounding such cases. In 1994, the federal Jacob Wetterling Act was passed. It was the time in American history that a law was passed that made it compulsory for each state to maintain a sex offender registry. This law helped countless other individuals over the years in solving the cases of their own missing children, and has left a legacy that will continue forever. But despite all they did to help others, the Wetterlings themselves still had no closure about what had happened to their beloved Jacob. They still hoped against hope that he might be alive, even though, as the years passed, this hope dwindled substantially. Enter Joy Baker, a 43-year-old mom of 2 who, in 2010, found herself drawn to the case of Jacob Wetterling when she got in her car one day and drove to the site of the abduction in St. Joseph. Joy had been 22 when Jacob was taken in 1989, and now that she sat there in the rural town and stared at the site, she felt like she had to find the answers. Not knowing where to begin, Joy did what she knew best. She was a blogger, and on October 23, 2010, she wrote a piece on her blog titled, "Where Are You, Jacob?" dedicated to the boy who had been missing for 21 years at this time. Little did she know that this would be the start of a journey that would consume the next few years of her life and take her to places she could never have imagined. From then on, one can see the road she went down, as every detail was meticulously recorded on her old-school blog as she dove into the case wholeheartedly, raising questions and following every possible lead she could. She pored over archived police files and newspaper articles, trying to find even the most minute bits of information about the case. And pretty soon, she found that during the original investigation, there had been a number of mistakes made. Law enforcement at the time had not followed up on credible leads. They'd mishandled evidence or sometimes completely lost it, and even failed to interview some key witnesses. Joy's research was so in-depth that one of her posts was even solely focused on the weather reports and the phases of the moon on the night of the abduction. From this, she realized that the witnesses would have found it difficult to see a car that night because the moon wouldn't have fully risen, which meant that the abduction would have taken place in complete darkness. And as Joy continued down the road she was on, following up on whatever information she could find about the decades-old case, she was led to someone who had been a part of the original investigation and whose case had been connected to Jacob's: Jared Sherrill. Jared, now a man in his 30s, still desperately wanted justice for the traumatic experience he'd been through as a child. Jared and Joy began to work on the case together as a team, and the real breakthrough came when they stumbled upon an archived newspaper article from 1987. This article describes a string of abductions and assaults on young boys that had taken place between 1986 and 1987. All of these had been committed in the same manner by a masked and armed man, and they'd all taken place in and around the small town of Paynesville, which was only about 30 minutes away from where Jacob had been taken. With Jared's help, Joy was able to track down a number of the victims and found that they were all now grown men who wanted answers for the atrocities they'd been subjected to all those decades ago. Together, Jared and Joy mapped out the location of each of the attacks into what they called the Paynesville Assault Cluster. They were shocked at the information they'd found and supplied it to the police, reinvigorating an investigation that had been dormant for decades. Suddenly, it became a huge story again, as Joy's blog went viral and tips came flooding in for the police as the case received national attention again. After this, Joy's blog went silent as the police investigation took over. Finally, in 2015, 26 years after the initial crime, police were back on the hunt. They had evidence of a foreign DNA profile that had been found on the sweater Jared had been wearing when he was abducted. Finally, on July 10, 2015, they found that this DNA profile could be matched to a man who was now 59 years old and who had lived in Paynesville at the time of the abduction. The man was none other than Daniel James Heinrich. He'd been involved in the original investigation and had been on Joy and Jared's radar as well, but there'd never been any concrete evidence to convict him. Finally, on October 27, 2015, a sealed criminal complaint was filed against Heinrich by Special Agent Shane Ball in the presence of U.S. Magistrate Judge Jeffrey J. Keyes. While the statute of limitations had expired on Jared's case, Heinrich was charged on 25 counts of other crimes. After this, he was arrested, and the case went to trial, where his attorneys took a plea deal where he would only be charged on the other crimes and not kidnapping or murder. And in return, on August 31, 2016, Heinrich showed them where he'd buried Jacob's body. The site was on a farm just outside Paynesville, about 30 miles from St. Joseph, not far from where Heinrich lived at the time. On September 6, 2016, almost a full 27 years after the abduction, Heinrich stood before the court and confessed to abducting, assaulting, and murdering Jacob Wetterling on that fateful night on October 22, 1989. He also confessed to the abduction of Jared that had taken place earlier that year. He narrated to the court how he'd been driving down the road when he noticed 3 young boys cycling along with their flashlights on the dark road. He said he pulled into a driveway and waited for them to cross it. Then he abducted Jacob and told the other 2 boys to run. and then he'd driven with Jacob to Painesville and an area he was familiar with. Here he'd shot and killed him and left his body in a gravel pit in a secluded area near a sewage pond road. He then returned home and waited for a couple of hours. After midnight, he went back to where he had left Jacob's body and then dragged him 100 yards to the north of where he'd shot him. There was some construction happening in the area, so he found a bobcat, which is an excavating machine that he knew how to operate. He used this to dig a grave and buried Jacob's body in it. He added that he'd returned to the grave about a year later and saw that it had been partially uncovered and Jacob's red jacket was visible at the time. This worried him, so he dug up as many remains as he could and took them across the highway to a rural farm in Painesville and reburied his remains there. This was the same place he pointed out to authorities after he was arrested for his many crimes. Heinrich was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. In January 2017, Heinrich was transferred to Federal Medical Center, Devons, a federal prison in Massachusetts, to serve his 20-year sentence. With the recovery of Jacob's body and Heinrich's confession, the decades-long investigation into one of the most heinous crimes to ever take place in the United States came to an end. After the case was closed, Jacob's remains were returned to the Wetterling family, who were able to give him a proper burial at the St. John's Abbey Friends Cemetery in Collegeville, Stearns County, Minnesota. Joy Baker, in her efforts to help solve the case, had become close friends with the Wetterling family along the way. She said that she never went into the investigation for fame or credit, but she was just a mom trying to help another mom. Through this awful tragedy, Patty Wetterling and Joy Baker have now become lifelong friends and even wrote a book together about their story titled Dear Jacob, A Mother's Journey of Hope. Patty herself is now a well-known figure for her work advocating for children's safety and for helping pass the Federal Wetterling Act that changed the landscape of the law regarding such cases in the United States. Jacob's family were heartbroken when they got the confirmation that he was actually gone. Patty Wetterling is quoted as saying, "It's incredibly painful to know his last days, last hours, last minutes. Our hearts are hurting. For us, Jacob was alive until we found him." Even though they now know for sure that their beloved Jacob is gone, his legacy lives on through the Jacob Wetterling Foundation and the Federal Wetterling Act passed in his name. While despicable men like Heinrich will likely never be completely eradicated, the Foundation and the Act ensure that they will not be able to get away with their crimes. And there we have it, folks, the tragic tale of Jacob Wetterling that was finally solved after 27 years due to the efforts of a mother who could not let the case go without finding answers for herself. But tell us, what do you think about this case? Do you think Heinrich should have gotten a longer sentence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true crime content. Until then, thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.